Sudan's government faces public anger in response to its newly announced austerity measures. Opposition forces reject the plan as calls for a change of leadership grow. Where will these protests lead, and what could it mean for the already complicated situation in Sudan? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Rida Fakhri. Welcome to the program. Protests are now in their sixth day in Sudan's capital. Anti-austerity demonstrations have swept across Khartoum. They're in response to government plans to cut jobs and raise fuel prices. The protests haven't always been peaceful. Riot police have fired tear gas, and civilians armed with machetes and swords have attacked protesters. The protests began after President al-Bashir announced the austerity measures earlier this week.
Structural reform will be carried out to the government bodies and the administration by reducing the constitutional posts on the level of the presidency, its supervisory institutions, and the national legislature. The reduction will also include the number of federal ministries, ministers, state ministers, experts, and those working within the frame of the presidency and the cabinet of ministers with more than 100 positions.
Sudan has been gripped by economic and political turmoil. Its rapidly deteriorating economy was made worse by South Sudan's secession last year, when it lost 75% of its oil revenues. The price of fuel has gone up by 60% after President Bashir announced a decision to remove fuel subsidies. Conflict in Darfur and South Kordofan continues to take a human as well as economic toll. And in the wake of this conflict, President Omar al-Bashir has become the first sitting head of state indicted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes. So then, has Sudan caught the spirit of the so-called Arab Spring? To discuss this, we're joined by Ishaq Asher Makki in London. He's the Secretary General of the Darfur Victims Organization for Relief and Rehabilitation and a human rights activist. Joining us in London as well, David Hoyle, Director of the Sudan Research Center. He's also the author of Darfur Road to Peace. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Ishaq Asher Makki, just how much pressure is the government in Khartoum under? How nervous will it be about these demonstrations?
I think they should be very, very nervous, and I think the pressure on them now is to the maximum, because everybody now is seeing what has been going on in the Arab world, the Arab Spring, and then they dare in this time to increase and lift the subsidies from the very, very important food and petrol supply to the Sudanese people. I think they dare to do that. I think that they chose their route and they're ending now. And I think people of Sudan have already suffered hugely by the genocide taken in Darfur, and the two genocide and mass murder in Nuba Mountains, and now happening in Nuba Mountain and Blue Nile as well. All of this happening in Sudan, and then they go on to lift these subsidies. I think they have made the wrong decision, and they have to suffer the consequence of this. And then we are in the UK here. We're communicating with people in Sudan now about the demonstration started a couple of days ago in Darfur, in Madani, in Sudan, but via the Facebook and the emails. We already people campaigning and deciding that this Friday, that people after the prayer of the Friday will demonstrate and come out to protest about all this happening in Sudan, including this lifting subsidies for the important food items, and also the genocide and the war happening in many parts of Sudan. I think the momentum now is getting on for all people in exile and inside Sudan. They have enough of these policies of the government, and they are now the president and many ministers are indicted to the genocide in The Hague and the ICC. I think it's time for them now to go, as the rest of the Arab world. I think people now getting together to organize the peaceful demonstration throughout the next coming few days.
But just focusing on the economic situation, if we could, and if I can move to David Hoyle, the government would argue that it had to take urgent measures to deal with the huge budget deficit on its hands, some $2.4 billion in budget deficit as a result of the lost oil revenues after the South seceded. It would argue that it had to do something, but was this the right time to add to people's problems socially, economically, inflation rising steadily every month, hitting some 30% in May, and now scrapping the oil subsidies? Was this the right time?
Well, I think actually, first of all, one should always try and cut away the sort of propaganda nonsense we just heard from the previous speaker. This is not an Arab Spring. I think 2, 3, 4 months ago you had 1 or 2 demonstrations which were also heralded as being the Sudan version of the Arab Spring. This is just absolutely not the case. The government in Sudan is a comparatively popular government, elected 1 or 2 years ago. What we're seeing, of course, is a difficulty for the government, but it's a difficulty which we've seen on the streets of Athens and even in London in recent months and years. So there were economic necessities, obviously, which every government faces. There was a very large budget deficit for reasons which I don't think anybody could have foreseen, which is that South Sudan chose to actually stop all the oil exports actually through Sudan itself. So,
but we did see the effects of what started off as economic problems, the effects of those on the streets in Cairo, didn't we?
Of course. Of course, but I think you've got to divorce wishful thinking on the part of certain sections of the anti-Sudan industry from the actual reality. The government in Sudan, and obviously some people aren't unhappy with this, but there's much more in touch with people on the street. In part because, of course, it has Islamist roots in its makeup. So I think it's very different from what you've actually seen in neighbours to the north of Sudan. But that said, of course, it's like any government. It has to balance a budget. It has to raise revenues, and those revenues are not there at the moment. And the cuts we are seeing now are the result of that.
Ishaq Ashar Maki, some within Sudan, like Hassan At-Turabi, the opposition figure, is saying that these measures will only affect the already poor and vulnerable of the Sudanese society. He says that these measures could end up being the last straw that broke the camel's back. Do you see it this way? I mean, are there enough numbers on the streets, enough people rising up against the government and demanding fundamental change?
Well, I think I agree with Dr. Hassan Turabi for some extent. It's the measures being taken recently is Sudan government has to take this because they are being stubborn to negotiate the oil with South Sudan, and they want to charge like half a barrel price of for the export. I think that's nonsense, and it's madness for the government of Sudan to demand that. And they force the South Sudan government to cut off the export of oil, and they need to come back and negotiate reality of this. And I think what they are trying to do is absolutely no government, no responsible government will take these measures with neighboring country which is newly born. I think they should have to now bear the consequence of that. And I think, as Hassan Turabi said, people in Sudan, they already suffering massively because of the situation of the economic, and by the bad decision that they're making, then they have to suffer a lot more. And I think people in Sudan now, they're about to break the fear barrier, and then whenever that fear barrier is being crossed, I think people all will come out, and I think we will see in the next few days increasing number of the demonstrators to come out and demand of their rights. I think the right thing to do now is just continue to demonstrate and continue to organize this kind of demonstration from the people in the exile and inside Sudan to stop these barbaric policies of the lifting the subsidies for the fuel and the sugar and all of the rest of the important items for the people of Sudan.
And David Hall, these demonstrations have spread beyond Khartoum to Omdurman, to other cities as well within Sudan. If they continue, if they in fact grow in intensity, what then for the government? You say there will be no Arab Spring in Sudan, but if the government isn't worried about its survival, why this clampdown on dissidents, the seizure of newspapers, the arrest of journalists? Why those types of measures if they weren't so worried?
Well, I think there are a number of factors here. One, of course, is that there obviously will be opportunists, and Dr. Hassan al-Turabi is one of them, and his party is very much to the right of the government in power in Khartoum at the moment. And we have also just heard just now from other opportunists in terms of the fringe of Darfurian politics, who of course are not in line with the Doha peace process, trying to solve that problem. So there will be difficulties. I think also you always have to bear in mind, and this is a very central issue, is that Sudan, in effect, ever since I've been watching it for 15 years, has been at various stages of war. You actually had its neighbour, South Sudan, acting very irrationally and actually invading Sudan a few months ago. So you have the prospect of war in the south. You have a simmering conflict in Darfur. You have what's happening now also on the border of South Sudan and Sudan in Kordofan and Blue Nile State, which again are insurrections against the government. So you do have very serious national security issues which have to be borne in mind. Whether that is in and of itself a crisis the government cannot actually deal with, I doubt. I think.
But can the government though deal with all these crises at once? You yourself mentioned the tenuous security situation in the oil-rich border region. Can Sudan manage its economic recovery alongside the military situation, the security situation in the country, without the 3/4 share of oil revenue that it has lost?
Sure. Well, I remember very well actually being sort of in Sudan, actually working in Sudan from the mid-1990s onwards, when there was no economy at all to actually talk of. You had, I think, 3 countries invading it at one stage in time in 97, 98. It's always been in a state of crisis as such. What you have within Sudan now is a very unexpected and very large budget deficit because of the irrational behaviour of the government issue to the south in South Sudan. There will be undoubtedly a transitional period because, again, unlike the South, South Sudan, Sudan has a much more, but in terms of an economy than they have. It's not based exclusively on oil. So there is a very rich agricultural sector. And I think we're looking at a transitional period where those old sectors of the economy will be revitalized. There'll be so much more investment going into it. Already that's happening. And I think it is very much a transitional period we're looking at. Will it actually weather it? Of course it will. It's weathered far more difficult crises in the past. And a few demonstrators on streets who are opportunistically using this as a means of actually furthering their politics on the extreme right or the extreme left. Well, I'm sure the government can deal with that.
Ishaq Ashrmaki, do you see this as mere opportunism, or is this much more than that? Will the government be looking back at 1964, that student-led protest movement, which then led to the ouster of the military regime in those days? Will it be looking back at this and seeing the potential that this protest movement can have?
Well, I think I'm very surprised by the description of David Hoy that the people of Sudan has not suffered. I think everybody in the world now have been following the case of Sudan from this genocide and attacking and civil wars happening. This is a decision by the leadership of Sudan, and they chose to do that. I think the suffering of Sudan in different regions of West and the Central and many in the East and many parts of Sudan have suffered enough in terms of economic destruction. In Darfur, for instance, there's no education that's formally happening. Infrastructure in terms of hospitals, the economic are so bad. People are suffering so badly, and yet David Hoy is saying that there's nothing and some opportunities. I think people had enough of suffering in terms of economic and war, and it's for them now to say no, and it's for them now to tell the leaders of this country it is far-fetched now. It's too much for them to bear. And I think what you mentioned, the people come out in 1964 and 1986 to take the Nimeri regime, and I think they are ready now to take on to this dictatorship again, because I think the policy that they are.
How organized is this movement? How potent can it be?
Well, it is because, as I said earlier, that's communication between all the people and inside Sudan via email and Facebook. And we also, from our side here, we have a demonstration today in the Embassy of Sudan, tomorrow in the 10 Downing Street. And there is connection in people inside in America and in Sudan that to go forward and continue this protest from inside. But we here see that today somebody has been killed in Sudan or in Khartoum, and somebody has arrested in Medani, and some few others in al-Bashir, and many people from the student of Darfur in Khartoum. This government I think is heading towards the Syrian style of heavy-handing this kind of demonstration, and therefore I think people is cautious, but I think they will come out and they will continue, and the will is there, and I believe this can happen with the continuation and of negotiation between people inside and outside. But I will dismiss this allegation of saying that opportunist. I think people have suffered for more than 20 years, and it's now for them to say no for this regime. I'm sorry for what said by David Hoy.
David Hoy, obviously some people are fed up with this government. Can they mobilize the numbers, though, against the government? Can they tap into this general feeling of being fed up, wanting more in terms of economic prosperity and political stability within the country? Or will what people call the heavy-handedness of the government, the authorities, serve as a catalyst against this movement?
Well, again, I think the simple fact is that no government ever is universally popular, and you know, as I said earlier, what we've seen in Greece, what we've seen in Spain and London, you know, are actual manifestations of that. There's no doubt. I do actually return again to this issue of wishful thinking. I mean, you just had a prime example of again what was actually said earlier. There is a very active diaspora who actually aren't on the ground in Sudan, who are making the most of this, actually, and trying to make the most of this. We'll see, I think, in the weeks and months ahead if this actually reaches a level which our previous speaker claimed. I don't think it will. I think the government is much more in touch with its electors than people actually realise, and of course the anti-Sudan industry will never accept that. And you know,
but why is it wishful thinking, though? I mean, we've seen the most robust regimes in the region fall recently.
Yeah, but they were not actually necessarily connected to their people, I think, in the way that this government has been since, you know, in effect 1989. I mean, love it or hate it, it has kept actually very close to its roots on the streets, and that has been one reason why it's actually remained in power this long. I don't think you can in any way connect it to the Libyan government or of Colonel Gaddafi or even the Egyptians. It's a far more robust government that has actually survived a whole range more crises than those governments ever dreamed of.
Ishaq Ashraf, do you accept this argument?
No, of course not. So I don't totally dismiss this, that the Sudan government have got links and to these people and have got very close to them. I think what had happened over the last 10 years, this kind of war after war after war after war, yet they would say that this government have got links and connected to its people. This is far-fetched. This is completely wrong, because millions of people has been died. How this is described, this connection to its people in the grassroots. I think this is far-fetched. I think the second decision that they've made, that to force the South Sudan government to give them half a barrel to export, who can accept this? I think this is irrational decision that they make. And I think they will see it otherwise, but I see it, this is the continuation of Arab rise, and the people of Sudan are Arabs, along with the neighboring countries, as happened in Egypt and Tunisia and in Libya. I don't see any difference why Sudan cannot happen in the Arab rising in Sudan. And this is the right time for me to people and come out and continue uprising to change the regime. I think people have got enough of it, because in Darfur we have got 300,000 being killed. In Nuba Mountains years ago, there's many people being killed, and now thousands are being killed in Nuba Mountains and Blue Nile. War in South Sudan, we have lost about 3 million people, and yet people say, well, Sudan, this is a normal, it's happening everywhere. Happening everywhere. No one killed in London or in Greece or in peaceful demonstrations cannot be killed, cannot be targeted with heavy-handed. This type of his style is happening in Syria, which is going to be very difficult. And the United Nations already issued a statement, and the United States as well, and people in Europe as well. They're all saying that this is heavy-handed. You cannot arrest people, the activist, the student, and then yet another person being killed today. And this is unacceptable for the policy of Sudan government, and that's what we don't want. We want them allow the peaceful demonstrations to come out and say what they believe that is wrong, and they have to accept and change these policies. That's what we want.
David Hoyle, is the government overplaying its hand? Should it see this coming, this level of discontent that we're hearing about? Is that something that the government should have expected, given the tactics that it's followed, given the fact that some people would argue that it hasn't invested in alternative sources of revenue, knowing full well that once it loses South Sudan, it would also get to the stage where it becomes almost bankrupt, where it will have to inflict this type of pain on ordinary civilians in a way that will only backfire?
Well, I think one or two of those arguments, do bear merit. I think, you can always, with hindsight, accuse any government, whether it's in the European Union or otherwise, of having to have actually looked at alternative issues and alternative funding programs. That's unfortunately very, very easy to do. The difficulty is, I think, that quite literally no rational human being expected the government of South Sudan to cut its nose off to spite its face. No one expects. I mean, the government of South Sudan is a government 99% dependent on oil revenues. No one expected that government to arbitrarily cut off every single penny of that oil revenue going north or south, actually, for that matter. It's extraordinary. And then also to, in fact, destroy some of the oil facilities in a neighboring country, Sudan. So they acted very much as a failed state would act, as a gangster state would act. No one actually expected it. And I think that budgets that, as of course always is the case, were drawn up a year ago, 18 months ago, never factored that into the account. So as a result, there is a deficit, and like any government, measures are taken to actually plug that deficit. If there are demonstrations and protests on the streets, well, that's actually what happens. If they become lawless and violent, then I think it's a matter for any government in any country in the world to actually deal with it as they see fit. I mean, we have a case right now in London where, in fact, a police officer is being tried for killing a protester a few years ago. So, I mean, deaths occur even within the European Union in public order incidents.
Ishaq Asharmaki, is the level of anger that we're seeing on the streets now with these protests that have gone on for a few days, that have gone beyond the capital itself, are they likely to translate into something bigger, into calls for proper reform, fundamental reform, into calls for the ouster of the president himself, or are we likely to see them contained in their demands and scope?
Well, first of all, let me say that we are talking here about North Sudan, and there is no one here from the south of Sudan to defend themselves about about the decision to stop the oil, exporting oil. I think they have got very, very good reasons because, as you said, David, that they are depending on the oil. I think to say this now without anybody from the other party to defend is not right. I think the question that you raised about the how much this demonstration will be. I think it started first in Omdurman, in Khartoum, and went to Darfur, and today Medani is one of the biggest states in central Sudan. And I think this will continue according to what we are experiencing through the emails and the Facebook.
Desak Osher-Maki and David Hoyle, thank you both very much for joining us and sharing your thoughts with us here on Inside Story. And thank you very much for joining us as well. Of course, your feedback, as always, is welcome. Just send us your emails at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me, Rida Fakhri, and the team, thanks for watching.